If you're planning to come to Australia, whether it is to visit or to live here, you're probably experiencing lots of emotions and are wondering how to prepare for your trip. How much time should I spend in Australia? When and where should I stay? What's the best way to get around? Is it actually safe? It's an exciting time, but there's a lot you need to consider. So in this video, we'll talk about key things you need to know before you come to Australia so you're fully ready and prepared for your trip. If you're interested, keep watching. One of the main questions people ask me when they're planning their trip to Australia is, what is the best time to visit? And my answer would be anytime, because there are things to do all year round. But at the end of the day, the time of the year you decide to come here will depend on your personal preferences as well as your budget. Because Australia is huge and the climate varies significantly from region to region. For example, summer here in Australia goes from December to February, and this is the peak tourist season, especially in popular cities like Sydney and Melbourne. During this season, you can expect warm to hot weather, which is perfect for beach activities and outdoor adventures. To give you an idea, during summer, average daily temperatures range from 20 degrees to 37 degrees. Having said that, summer is also the wet season, especially in northern parts of Australia, which means that it will be hot, humid, and you may have a few thunderstorms. And there are parts of northern Australia where you can't swim during this time because it's stinger season. Also take into consideration that summer is the most expensive time of the year to travel, so always consider your budget. Now, the next season is autumn, and this goes from March to May, with mild temperatures ranging between 17 degrees and 35 degrees in Australia as a whole. This is an amazing time to travel to this country because there are fewer crowds compared to summer, and flights tend to be a bit more affordable. And the best part is that you still have access to plenty of outdoor activities, sightseeing and exploring without the heat. And if you come to Melbourne, for example, you'll get to see the beautiful autumn colors all around the city. Having said that, if you're a beach lover, perhaps coming in autumn might not be the best idea, because it will be very chilly to go for a swim, at least in the southern parts. But if you're a water baby like me, just go for it. Now, winter in Australia varies from region to region, and average temperatures can go from 8 degrees in the south to 30 degrees in the north. For example, northern areas like Queensland and the Northern Territory, they warm almost all year round, whereas southern regions like Victoria and Tasmania can get pretty chilly. Winter is an amazing time as well to go whale watching or even go skiing in the Australian Alps. And it's also a great time to visit more warmer regions like Broome, Cairns and the Great Barrier Reef, because it's a dry season, so you'll most likely have clear and blue skies when you visit. Now, spring in Australia goes from September through to November, with average daily temperatures ranging from 17 degrees and 35 degrees. This is also the wildflower season, with blooming flora all around the country. For example, you have wildflowers in Perth, jacarandas in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, lavender in Tasmania. And spring is also an amazing time for outdoor activities, like hiking and visiting national parks, wineries and coastal towns. And similar to autumn, flight tickets during this season tend to be a bit more affordable. As you can see, Australia is huge, so weather conditions can vary significantly depending on where you go. So plan according to the activities that you want to do and the type of climate that you're willing to endure. Now, another thing that many people coming to Australia tell me is that they weren't really mentally prepared for such long travels. And at the time of booking the flights, they were a bit shocked. And this is definitely something that you should know. Traveling to Australia often involves very long flights, mainly because of the country's geographical location and distance from many other countries. So depending on where you're coming from, you can expect between 10 to 24 hours, or in some instances up to 30-something hours of travel time. So brace yourself, travel times are long. I've also been receiving many emails asking me what activities should I do when I'm in Australia. And as I said, Australia is huge, so there's a lot to explore all around the country, especially if you love the outdoors, the beach and water activities. But because I can't include every single activity in this video, here's a list of the main places that perhaps you should visit when you come here. The first one, of course, is Sydney. I highly recommend exploring landmarks such as the Sydney Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You can relax on Bondi Beach Beach or Manly, visit the historic Rocks District, or even go on a day trip to the beautiful national park, Blue Mountains. Another place that you should visit when you come to Australia is Melbourne, which is, in my opinion, the most European city in Australia, and experience the city's beautiful Victorian architecture, lively art scene, and world-class dining from all over the world. I also recommend walking around Melbourne's laneways to find the amazing street art and graffiti that characterizes this beautiful city. Now, speaking of Melbourne, I highly recommend visiting the Great Ocean Road when you come here. This is a beautiful coastal route in the state of Victoria, where you'll get to see the 12 Apostles, rock formations, Lockhart Gorge, and the beautiful seaside towns. And for diving and snorkeling, and this is one of the must-see activities I think here in Australia, is the Great Barrier Reef. I've been, and it's amazing. Something to consider though is that there are some areas where the coral is completely bleached, so highly recommend doing a bit of research in terms of where they're going to take you, because when I was there, some parts were amazing, but the majority was all white, so yeah, that's something you need to consider. Another amazing spot to visit here in Australia, and especially when you're on holidays, is the Whitsunday Islands, especially if you're into relaxing on pristine beaches, going sailing around the islands, or snorkeling in crystal clear waters. Another must-see Australian destination is the sacred monolith of Uluru in the Northern Territory. Here you'll have the opportunity to learn about Australia's Aboriginal culture and history. And if you're in the Northern Territory, you can also go to Kakadu National Park, which is Australia's biggest national park and a World Heritage listed location, featuring more than 5,000 Aboriginal rock art sites. Now, if you have enough time and you're feeling adventurous, you can also go to Western Australia and visit the Kimberley, which is also a good alternative for experiencing Australia's most precious wilderness, stunning gorges, waterfalls, and ancient Aboriginal rock art. And lastly, another interesting place to visit is Tasmania, or Tassie for the locals. I highly recommend going to Mount Wellington, Cradle Mountain, Bruny Island, Port Arthur, which is a convict-era site, and Wineglass Bay if you're into the outdoors. And a must-see activity in Tasmania is going to the Mona Museum, which in my personal opinion is one of the most bizarre places I've seen in my life, but it's very worth it. Now, if you want to go deeper into the different Australian cities and places to visit, I have a few videos on this channel for you to check out. Now, as I said, Australia is huge and there are so many places to visit here that I couldn't really cover everything in this video. So if you're Australian and you have any other recommendations, leave a comment below. Now, having said that, many people ask me, especially those that are coming for a visit, how much time should I spend in Australia? And as you can see, it's impossible for you, if you're coming just for a temporary visit, to really cover everything that Australia has to offer. So my best advice is to consider your must-see activities, your personal preferences, and your budget. And again, remember that distances here in Australia are long, so you need to consider this when it comes to travel times. As a general rule, I always recommend people to come for a minimum of 2 weeks. Less than that, and you won't even have time to recover from jet lag. Now, another question that I often get asked is, what's the best way to get around in Australia? And the answer is, you have a few range of options. The first option is domestic flights. So if you come to visit and you want to fly between cities, as I said, Australia is huge, so flying between major cities and regions is often the quickest way to travel long distances. And flying time between cities is usually 1 to 5 hours. The second option is to rent a car or a camper van. This gives you the flexibility to explore Australia at your own pace. And this option is ideal for road trips along scenic routes like the Great Ocean Road, the east coast of Australia, or through the Australian outback. Just be prepared for long stretches of driving, especially in remote areas. Having said that, if you don't want to drive or if you don't have a license, the best thing that you can do is to book a guided tour. Another option is public transportation. Major cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth have extensive public transportation networks, including trains, buses, trams, and ferries. And this option is the most convenient for getting around within cities and inner suburbs. For a dedicated video on how to use public transport here in Australia, I'll leave you a link down below. Train travel is another alternative, although rare, and definitely more expensive. For example, there are a few iconic train journeys, such as the Indian Pacific, Sydney to Perth, the Gang, Adelaide to Darwin, and the Overland, Melbourne to Adelaide. So this is another option to explore if you're interested in those kind of experiences. Another transport option is coach and bus services, which connect cities and regional towns across Australia. And while not the fastest alternative, they can be more affordable than flying, especially if you're on a budget and you have enough time. A bonus tip, and something that many people forget, is to please bring your international driver's license. This should be in English or translated in English, otherwise you can get in a lot of trouble and you'll need this document as well to hire a car here. And please don't forget as well that here in Australia, we drive on the left side of the road. This is super important to remember and to keep in mind because accidents do happen. And I've experienced this firsthand. Friends coming over, they were used to driving on the other side and it was very, very stressful. Now, something else that many people wonder when they're planning their trip here is where to stay. So my best advice is, if you're coming as a tourist, basically for a short visit, I highly recommend staying in inner city suburbs close to the city or right in the CBD, the Central Business District, whether it is in a hotel, hostel or Airbnb. This way you'll have access to public transportation to easily move around the main attractions and go to the beach. And in some instances, you'll be able to just walk around or hire a city bike or scooter without the need to take public transport. Now, if you're coming to Australia as a temporary or permanent resident to live, work or study, my best advice is to rent an Airbnb for the first 2 to 4 weeks to settle nicely, and during that time you can look for more permanent accommodation, whether it is a share house or a property for yourself. If you want to know more about how to rent a property in Australia, I have a full video about that, link down below. Another super important thing to know is that here in Australia, we don't have a tipping culture because the service is included in the meal. And hospitality staff here in Australia are paid a living wage, which includes service charges, so there's no need to leave a tip, and that's not really part of the culture, as I said. And a funny anecdote in relation to this is that I've gotten so used to the no tipping culture here in Australia that when I flew to San Francisco, when I was there for holidays, I remember that I went to this restaurant with my sister and I forgot to leave a tip. So I left and suddenly I can hear someone screaming. It was the waitress chasing me down the street, yelling, "The tip, please give me the tip." Yeah, I had to go back to the restaurant and pay, but that's very interesting how the tipping culture, for example, in the US is so ingrained, whereas here in Australia, we don't have that. So that's something you need to consider. And you would only leave a tip if you think that the service was exceptional. But again, this is not a requirement and it's not frowned upon if you don't do so. Now, how does the money work here in Australia? Well, we mainly use credit cards. It's almost a cashless society, although some people do like using cash, and that's all right. For that, if you want to do so, you have ATMs available all over the city. But otherwise, you can pay with your card, with your phone, contactless payments, and you'll be good to go. Another super important thing to know when you're preparing for your trip is that here in Australia, we use Type I plugs, which is a plug that has 3 flat pins in the form of a triangle. And the standard voltage is 230 volts with a frequency of 50 Hertz. So make sure you get an adapter specifically designed for Type I outlets. Now, when it comes to mobile phone plans, Australia has several major mobile network operators, including Telstra, Optus and Vodafone. So if your phone is unlocked, you can easily purchase a prepaid SIM card or an eSIM with an Australian phone number, so you get access to calls and internet during your whole stay. And of course, many cafes, hotels and public spaces all around Australia offer free Wi-Fi. So it is a good idea to take advantage of this when you're here, when you're traveling around, so you can save on your data. Another thing that many people get surprised, especially friends or family visiting, is that the dress code here in Australia is super casual. So if you're coming to visit here or even to live, there's no need to dress in a fancy way if you want to, of course. But I think the best part of the Australian culture is that it's very laid back and no one cares about what you're wearing. Of course, if you're going to a fancy restaurant or to a wedding, you should definitely wear formal attire, right? And if you're going to be working here, then dressing smart casual is the way to go. For example, a collar shirt, blouses, dresses, skirts, and trousers. But for everyday life, wearing a t-shirt, shorts, jeans, sundresses, and comfortable footwear like sandals or sneakers are perfectly okay. And if you're planning to go to the beach, of course, make sure you pack your swimmers and flip-flops, known as thongs in Australia. Pro tip, if you're coming to Melbourne, bring a rain jacket because the weather is pretty crazy. Another question that I often get asked from people coming to Australia is, what should I eat? And I think this is a fair question because I remember my first week in Australia, everything seemed a bit daunting when I would go to a restaurant or to a cafe and have lunch. The menu was a bit overwhelming. There were many options that I wasn't familiar with. And the thing is that Australia, if you're not aware, is super multicultural. So you can expect to find a wide range of food options, from modern Australian food to fresh seafood, Asian, Italian, Mediterranean food, meat pies, barbecue, lots of craft beer and wine, and an amazing coffee culture. And for sweets and desserts, the Australian classics are lamingtons, pavlova, and Tim Tams. And bonus tip, don't leave Australia without having tried Vegemite, the famous Australian spread. Another thing that you may be wondering if you're coming to Australia is restaurants and shops opening times. In Australia, lunch service usually starts at 11:30 a.m. and dinner are around 5:30 p.m., with most kitchens closing at 8:30, 9 p.m. So if you're from countries like Spain, Italy, or Argentina, brace yourself, you'll have to adapt because it's very unlikely that you'll be able to find a restaurant that's open at 10 p.m. In these countries, think 10 p.m., 9:30 is the peak hour. Whereas here in Australia, most people are already in bed. At least that's me and my friends. Very different culturally in that regard. Now, if you want to buy clothing, most retail shops here in Australia open their doors at 9 a.m. and close between 5 and 9 p.m. Bonus tip, if you are planning to do grocery shopping when you're here, the major supermarket chains are Woolworths, Coles, Aldi, and IGA. And another thing in relation to this is that if you want to get alcohol, for example, a bottle of wine, don't expect to find it in supermarket aisles. Alcohol here in Australia is actually sold in separate bottle shops. So that's something to keep in mind. Another pretty important thing to know is that Australian cities and towns have high quality drinking tap water, so it's generally safe to drink. So there's really no need to get bottled water. And actually you'll find water fountains and water bottle refill stations all around Australian cities and parks. Now, having said that, if you're traveling to more remote or rural areas when you're in Australia, I highly recommend checking with the locals on the safety of the tap water because the water quality in these areas can vary. Or for example, if you go camping, you usually have signs like this water is not safe for drinking. So in that instance, usually you carry your own water. And another very important thing to know in relation to this is that tap water in Australian restaurants is free. So again, there's no need to buy bottled water. And if you weren't aware, this is actually regulated. Any Australian premise that supplies alcohol for consumption is required to provide drinking water upon request. So keep that in mind. Another concern many people have when visiting Australia, and this is, I think, one of the main concerns, is Australia safe? Should I be worried about dangerous animals? And my answer is always yes. Australia is a super safe country with very low crime rates compared to many other nations. However, like any other country in the world, things do happen, of course. So my best advice is to take common sense precautions to ensure your safety and well-being throughout your trip. But yes, it's safe. Now, in terms of dangerous animals, as you may be aware, Australia has a very diverse and unique wildlife, which includes some animals that may pose some risks to humans. Having said that, I've been living here for almost 10 years, and encountering a dangerous animal, at least in the major cities, is extremely rare. But here are a few tips if you want to stay safe. Follow safety guidelines, so pay attention to warning signs and local advice, especially when visiting national parks, beaches, or areas known for wildlife sightings, such as jellyfish, sharks, crocodiles, snakes, and spiders. And if you're going to swim, do so in designated areas, and wear protective clothing and footwear if needed. And my second tip is to respect wildlife, and this means keeping a safe distance from wild animals and refraining from feeding or approaching them. Don't disturb them. And bonus tip, again, if you're thinking of getting in the water when you're here, I highly recommend knowing how to swim. Please, if you don't know how to swim, just don't get in the water because tourist drownings are actually a thing. So be careful. Another important thing to know is that when you're here in Australia, sun protection is key. And considering this country receives high UV radiation all year round, I highly recommend being sun smart when you're here and following the slip, slop, slap strategy. Slip on sun protective clothing, slop on SPF 30 or higher sunscreen, slap on a hat. And another thing that's pretty cool is that some Australian beaches actually have free sunscreen stations. So if you forgot your sunscreen, try to find one of those. And another important thing to know, this is a surprising thing perhaps for many of you, especially if you've never been to Australia, is that Australian public toilets are free and super clean. So this is amazing if you're planning to walk around the city for a long time, or if you're planning to go hiking or camping. Please don't be afraid of using these toilets. I've traveled to other countries and in some instances they're not great, but here in Australia they are. And another thing that you may want to know is that here in Australia, if you go camping or hiking in national parks, something that you'll find is that most public toilets are actually dry. So if you don't have experience using composting or dry toilets, be prepared for that. Now, if you want to know more about what is it like to live, work, study and travel here in Australia, highly recommend watching these videos here and here. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe to keep supporting the channel so I can keep bringing more content for you. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye.